Every year, something absolutely extraordinary happens that most of us never think about. Billions of birds, small creatures with hollow bones and feathers, lift off the ground and fly across oceans. Not ponds, not rivers, but actual oceans. Thousands of miles over water, where there's nothing to land on, nothing to eat, nowhere to rest. They do this twice a year. They navigate without GPS, without maps, without any of the tools we think are essential for travel. They find their way across continents, across hemispheres, and return to almost the exact same spot where they started. This isn't instinct in the simple sense you might think of it. This is a kind of knowledge that's been written into their biology so deeply that young birds can make these journeys without ever being taught, without their parents, without anyone showing them the way. And when you start looking at how they actually do this, at what mechanisms their bodies and brains possess, the whole thing becomes almost unbelievable. Because birds have figured out navigation systems that we've only recently started to understand. Let's begin with what migration actually is, because it's more complicated than just flying south for the winter. Migration is a seasonal movement, but not in the casual sense. It's predictable. It happens at the same times each year, and it follows the same routes with remarkable consistency. But it's not random wandering. It's not birds fleeing cold weather on a whim or following food sources haphazardly. It's a finely tuned system that's been evolving for millions of years, tied directly to food availability, to breeding seasons, to the angle of the sun and the length of the day. The photoperiod, the amount of daylight, triggers physiological changes in birds. It starts the migration cycle. Hormones shift. Behavior changes. The bird knows its time, even before the weather gets cold. Every year, billions of birds move between breeding grounds and wintering grounds. We're not talking about one or two well-known species. We're talking about hundreds of different bird species, all with slightly different strategies, all with slightly different routes and timing. Some species make short trips, a few hundred miles. Others make journeys that dwarf anything a human explorer has attempted. The scale of this is genuinely hard to grasp. We're not talking about hundreds of birds. We're not even talking about millions. We're talking about billions of individual creatures moving in coordinated patterns across the planet, guided by internal compasses that are more sophisticated than anything engineers could create a century ago. The timing is synchronized. Millions of birds don't just randomly take off on different days. They concentrate their departure into windows of a few days or weeks, all moving together, creating weather patterns visible on radar. The distances involved are staggering. The Arctic tern, a small seabird that weighs less than a few ounces, travels roughly 44,000 miles every single year. That's a round trip between the Arctic and the Antarctic. Think about that for a moment. If you flew 44,000 miles a year, every year of your life, for 70 years, you would cover the same distance this tiny bird covers in a single year. A bird that could fit in your hand. A bird made almost entirely of feathers and bone and air. One Arctic tern that was tracked with a geolocator tag covered 96,000 kilometers in just 10 months, flying not just the length of the Atlantic Ocean, but the width of the Indian Ocean and halfway across the South Pacific, to the boundary between the Ross and Amundsen Seas, before returning back west along the Antarctic coast, and then back up the Atlantic again. This isn't a calculation or an estimate. These are actual documented journeys tracked with modern satellite technology. Scientists placed tiny tags on these birds that weighed less than a few grams, and those tags recorded location data that showed the exact paths these birds were taking. And the remarkable part is that this bird makes intelligent decisions about its route. It doesn't just fly in a general direction and hope for the best. scientists discovered that Arctic terns don't simply fly in straight lines toward their destination. They make detours of several thousand miles, long zigzagging routes that seem inefficient on a map, but are actually highly efficient when you account for wind patterns and energy expenditure. These birds take advantage of global wind patterns. They preserve energy by using seasonal winds that blow in the direction they're traveling. They follow routes that make the impossible journey actually survivable. The Manx shearwater is another example of extreme oceanic migration. These birds migrate 14,000 kilometers between their northern breeding grounds off the coast of Britain and the Southern Ocean near Argentina and South Africa. They breed on small islands in the North Atlantic and spend their winters crossing the entire Atlantic Ocean to the opposite hemisphere. Over their lifetime, some of these birds can fly 8 million kilometers. 8 million kilometers. Think about that number for a second. A single bird's lifetime of flying covers the distance to the moon 20 times over. If we're being precise, the moon is only about 384,400 kilometers away. A bird that flies 8 million kilometers in its lifetime travels enough to go to the moon and back 10 times. And these birds are doing this year after year, decade after decade, with remarkable precision. They're returning to the exact same breeding grounds, sometimes the exact same burrow, after spending months on the opposite side of the world, in areas they might not visit again for another year. One Manx shearwater is recorded to have lived for over 50 years, which means that bird covered more than 8 million kilometers in its lifetime. That's the equivalent of traveling around the Earth 2 million times. The bar-tailed godwit holds the record for the longest non-stop flight of any bird, and the numbers involved are genuinely shocking. Over 12,000 kilometers without a single break to rest or feed. The bird takes off from Alaska and doesn't stop until it reaches New Zealand. For 9 or 10 days straight, this bird is flying continuously, not sleeping, not eating, just flying. It loses nearly half its body weight during the journey. A bird that might weigh 400 grams before departure might weigh only 200 grams when it arrives. It's essentially flying on fumes by the end. The bird navigates across a featureless ocean where there are no landmarks, no visible features that distinguish one part of the water from any other. Imagine flying for 10 days and seeing nothing but water. No islands, no coastlines, nothing to confirm you're going in the right direction. The bird must arrive within a window of just a few hours, or the consequences are fatal. If it overshoots New Zealand by even a small amount, if wind pushes it slightly off course, there's nothing to land on. Just more water, just open ocean, just death. The margin for error is 0. The bird either gets this right or it dies. The sheer endurance required for these journeys is almost beyond comprehension when you think about it. A human couldn't survive 10 days without food and water. We'd collapse from fatigue. We'd hallucinate. Our bodies would shut down. But birds don't do this through willpower or determination or any kind of mental toughness. They do it through systematic physiological preparation that's almost alien in its precision. Before these massive journeys, birds enter a state called hyperphagia. It's essentially controlled frenzied eating. They consume enormous amounts of food, usually berries rich in carbohydrates and fats, and convert those calories into fat tissue. A bar-tailed godwit will nearly double its body weight before attempting the Pacific crossing. A bird that might weigh 190 grams will balloon up to nearly 400 grams. It's preparing the way an astronaut prepares for a space mission. Every system in the body is being optimized for the task ahead. The digestive system becomes hyper-efficient. The bird can absorb and process food faster than normal. Every bit of energy extracted from food is immediately converted to fat and stored. And studies show that birds are even more sophisticated than this simple feeding strategy. About 3 weeks before migration actually begins, birds actually decrease their metabolism. They're slowing their body down, conserving energy before they even leave. This counterintuitive move, slowing down before the massive effort, actually saves energy during the pre-migration period. This metabolic preparation can use less energy than the actual flight itself. Think about that. The preparation period uses less energy than flying across an ocean for 10 days. The bird is tuning its body like a finely calibrated instrument, making minute adjustments to maximize efficiency. It's not just feeding more, it's physically reorganizing itself. Internal organs shift. Digestive organs shrink because the bird won't need to digest food during the journey. Flight muscles grow and strengthen. The heart enlarges. Everything unnecessary is stripped down, and everything essential is enhanced. The bird becomes a flying machine, optimized for distance and endurance. So let's talk about how these birds actually navigate, because this is where it gets genuinely strange, almost like science fiction. In 1955, a German ornithologist named Gustav Kramer proposed something radical that's only recently been fully validated by modern research. He suggested that birds use two completely different systems to navigate. First, they have what he called a mental map. This is geographic knowledge, an internal representation of the landscape and how to get from one place to another. It's not a simple visual memory. It's more like an understanding of position, of location in space relative to other locations. A bird somehow knows where it is and where it needs to go on a map scale that spans continents. Second, birds have a compass, a biological compass that allows them to orient themselves in a particular direction. They can take that mental map and use the compass to figure out which way they need to go to get where they're trying to reach. A bird knows where Brazil is, and it knows which direction Brazil is relative to its current position, and it can combine those two pieces of information to navigate correctly. The fascinating part is that birds don't rely on just one compass system. They have at least 3 separate independent compass systems. If one fails, there are backups. If 2 fail, there's still a third. This redundancy is crucial because the ocean environment where these birds navigate is often hostile to traditional navigation cues. Sometimes the sky is cloudy, and celestial navigation is impossible. Sometimes magnetic storms disrupt the Earth's magnetic field. Sometimes atmospheric conditions change. Birds need multiple systems so that failure in one doesn't mean death. Young birds hatch with genetic programming that gives them a basic idea of where they should head when the season changes. It's almost incomprehensible, but many birds make their first migration without their parents, without any teaching whatsoever. The parents might have died, the young bird might have hatched late, and the parents might have left already. Regardless, the young bird knows where to go. This is purely innate knowledge, somehow encoded into the bird's genetics. It's like the bird is born with an instruction manual written into its DNA, but it's not complete knowledge. Young birds gradually refine their navigation skills over their lifetime. They learn specific landmarks, they calibrate their internal systems, they develop expertise through repetition. But that initial push, that first journey, that comes preloaded into their biology. Experiments have shown that before birds make their first migration, they actually learn something specific and deliberate. They observe the nighttime rotation of stars around the North Star. Young birds literally spend time learning the night sky, teaching themselves which direction is north by watching constellations rotate. They're doing this before they ever need the information, essentially cramming for a test they know is coming. They develop what researchers call an internal compass that uses the sun and stars to orient themselves. And they have an internal 24-hour clock that allows them to compensate for the movement of celestial bodies throughout the year and the changing angle of the sun at different latitudes as they fly south or north. A bird can look at the sun in the morning, know what time it is based on internal clock calculations, and from those two pieces of information determine which direction is which. If the sun is in the east and it's 6 a.m., the bird knows where north is. Some birds use an entirely different mechanism than stars or sun or magnetic fields. They follow their noses, literally. In 2017, researchers conducted a study where they temporarily blocked the sense of smell in seabirds called Scopoles shearwaters by washing their nasal passages with a harmless chemical called zinc sulfate. The birds lost their ability to navigate properly. Birds that normally navigate with precision started making mistakes. This strongly suggests that these birds are following scent cues across the ocean, smelling their way to their destination. The sense of smell in birds was dramatically underappreciated for a very long time. For decades, scientists studied bird navigation and largely ignored olfaction. It was treated as a minor sense, something birds use to find food, but not much else. Scientists didn't take it seriously as a navigation tool, but recent research shows it's incredibly important for navigation, particularly for seabirds that cross featureless oceans where there are no visual landmarks to guide them. The ocean has scent gradients, different water masses, different currents. They all have distinct odor signatures. Cold water smells different than warm water. Nutrient-rich water smells different than barren water. Birds can apparently follow these olfactory highways across the open sea the way a dog follows a scent trail. A bird might be smelling its way home across thousands of kilometers of apparently featureless water, detecting concentration gradients in the air, following scent trails that are invisible to us. Now we get to the truly strange part, the magnetic field navigation. And this part involves quantum mechanics, which tells you how advanced bird biology actually is. Researchers have discovered a small spot on the beak of pigeons and some other birds that contains magnetite. Magnetite is a magnetized rock, literally a magnetic mineral embedded in the bird's beak. It acts like a tiny biological compass, giving the bird information about its position relative to Earth's poles. The bird's beak is essentially a GPS unit. It can feel the direction of magnetic north and use that to orient itself. But there's more to the story, and it gets genuinely weird. Experiments on migratory birds provide evidence that they also use a completely different system based on a cryptochrome protein in the eye. This protein can sense magnetic fields through quantum mechanics. Yes, quantum mechanics. The same physics that governs subatomic particles is being used by birds to navigate. When a blue light photon hits a cryptochrome protein in a bird's eye, it creates something called a radical pair. A radical pair is a set of quantum particles that are incredibly sensitive to even faint variations in the surrounding magnetic field. The radical pair entangles with the magnetic field and creates a quantum effect that the bird's brain can detect. A bird can literally see the magnetic field. It perceives it visually, not just as an abstract sense, but as something it can observe in its own visual field, like a color overlay or a pattern in the sky. This quantum biological mechanism is one of the most sophisticated and least understood aspects of avian navigation. We've only recently figured out that it exists through careful laboratory experiments. Birds have been using this mechanism for millions of years. They figured out how to exploit quantum mechanics long before humans even knew quantum mechanics existed. Different birds seem to rely on different navigation systems depending on their ecological niche and their environment. Some are primarily magnetic field navigators, using the Earth's magnetic field as their main compass. Others use celestial cues almost exclusively, preferring to navigate by sun and stars. Many seem to use combinations of all three navigation systems, plus smell, plus visual landmarks, plus whatever else is available. This redundancy, this reliance on multiple systems, seems to be the rule rather than the exception. It's like each bird is carrying backup navigation systems in case the primary ones fail. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior in Germany used advanced GPS tracking technology to follow 5 different species of large land birds that make long sea crossings. These aren't seabirds. These are land birds, birds that evolved to live in forests and on the ground, not birds that evolved for ocean flying, yet they successfully cross oceans. What the researchers discovered was that all these birds exploited wind and uplift to reduce energy costs during flight. They weren't just flying in a general direction and hoping. They were analyzing atmospheric conditions and adjusting their routes to benefit from the best conditions available. Some birds were riding thermal updrafts that rise above the ocean surface, soaring hundreds of meters in the air, traveling distances with barely any energy expenditure at all. Thermals are rising columns of warm air. They occur over land more readily, but they do form over water in certain conditions. A bird riding a thermal doesn't need to flap. It just rides the rising air like an elevator, gaining altitude without expending energy, then gliding to the next thermal. The oriental honey buzzard, for example, flies 700 kilometers over the East China Sea during its annual migration from Japan to Southeast Asia. The entire crossing takes roughly 18 hours. The birds do this in autumn when atmospheric conditions are optimal. They don't just fly whenever they feel like migrating. They wait for the right conditions. They wait until the wind patterns are favorable, until the thermals are working properly, until the physics of the atmosphere are aligned in their favor, and then they go. They're not just following instinct. They're making strategic decisions about timing. The strategy is different for different species, and evolution has optimized each approach for specific environments and flight styles. Some land birds can't rely on thermals the way raptors do, so they use tailwind instead. A tailwind is literally wind blowing in the direction the bird is flying. It reduces the energy required to move forward. A bird flying in a strong tailwind uses drastically less energy than a bird flying into a headwind over the same distance. The difference can be enormous. A headwind can add days to a journey or make a journey impossible. So birds wait for tailwind conditions before attempting long ocean crossings. They're constantly reading weather patterns, consulting internal atmospheric pressure sensors, waiting for their moment. When conditions are right, when the forecast shows favorable winds, they depart. They're not making random decisions based on instinct or whim. They're making calculated ones based on atmospheric information they can somehow sense and interpret. The exact mechanism of atmospheric sensing is still not fully understood, but it definitely happens. Some birds use horizontal wind to speed their travel. Some birds use vertical wind currents to gain altitude while conserving energy. Some birds use a combination of both strategies. The bar-tailed godwit has evolved to use massive fat stores and sheer endurance, relying on its ability to survive without food for days. Other birds have evolved to use atmospheric conditions and environmental timing, relying on strategic timing and route optimization. Both strategies work. Both strategies get the bird from point A to point B. Evolution has produced multiple valid solutions to the same problem. Once a bird arrives at its destination after a multi-thousand-kilometer journey over open water, it needs to refuel. These stopover sites are critical. A bird can't just plop down anywhere and rest. It needs a place where food is abundant. This is where things get incredibly tight in terms of timing. The red knot, another shorebird that makes a 15,000-kilometer migration from Arctic breeding grounds to South America, depends on a very specific event. It needs to arrive at Delaware Bay during horseshoe crab spawning season. The horseshoe crabs come ashore to lay eggs. The red knots descend on the area and eat those eggs in enormous quantities to rebuild their depleted fat stores. This has to happen at exactly the right time. If the crabs spawn too early, the knots arrive and there's nothing to eat. If the knots arrive too late, the eggs are gone. These are two species that have never seen each other before, that evolved on completely different continents, but they've synchronized their life cycles with such precision that they meet at the exact right moment every single year. It's one of the most tightly coordinated relationships known in nature. And if timing gets disrupted by anything, climate change, habitat loss, pollution, the entire system can collapse. The energy demands of these journeys are extreme and almost incomprehensible. When a bird is in flight for extended periods, it's burning energy at a rate more than 10 times above its resting metabolic rate. When a bird is resting, it burns calories at a baseline rate. When it's flying, it burns calories at more than 10 times that baseline rate. To put that in perspective, a Tour de France cyclist, one of the most elite human endurance athletes on the planet, sustains a metabolic rate around 5 times their resting rate. Over the entire race, for weeks at a time, these athletes maintain a metabolic rate 5 times higher than normal. Birds are doing something more extreme than that, for days on end, sometimes weeks on end. Birds sustain 10 times resting metabolic rate. And they're doing it on fat stores they built up in just a few weeks before departure. There's no sponsorship. There's no support crew. There's no aid stations. Just the bird and its stored fat, and the sky ahead. The fuel strategy is fascinating and reveals just how sophisticated avian physiology is. Early in a flight, when a bird first takes off, when it needs water and amino acids to maintain bodily functions, about 30% of its energy comes from protein. The bird is burning muscle and tissue protein to generate water for hydration. But once the bird settles into rhythm, once it's been flying for a few hours, and its body adjusts to sustained flight, that drops to less than 3%. The bird is almost entirely fat-driven. It's burning protein early when it needs it most for water, then transitioning to almost pure fat metabolism for sustained endurance. It's like a rocket that burns different fuel stages depending on the phase of flight. The physiological adjustments are incredible to contemplate. The body's organs actually reorganize before migration even begins. The digestive system essentially shuts down because the bird won't be eating. The liver shrinks because it won't need to process food. The heart grows larger and more powerful. The flight muscles grow and become denser. Reproductive organs shrink. Everything non-essential is trimmed away. Everything essential is enhanced. Everything is optimized for a single purpose: get from point A to point B. The bird's entire physiology is reconfigured to support one goal. When birds finally reach a stopover site after days of flying over featureless ocean or desert, they have a limited window to recover. Time is the enemy. Every day spent on the ground is a day not moving toward the destination. A migrating garden warbler that has just crossed the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea arrives completely depleted. It has flown for days over one of the harshest environments on Earth. Its body is wrecked. Its body mass has plummeted. Its flight muscles have been catabolized for fuel. The bird is essentially starving, even though it still has some energy reserves left. The bird has maybe 5 days to rest before it needs to continue. The window is tight. If it rests too long, it will be late arriving at breeding grounds. But if it rests too little, it won't have enough reserves to complete the rest of the journey. In that 5-day window, the bird recovers with remarkable speed. It feeds obsessively, consuming insects and berries. It rebuilds fat stores. It rebuilds muscle tissue. The plasticity of the avian body is extraordinary. It's like the bird has a recovery protocol built into its biology. Arrive depleted, rest, feed, rebuild, and then go again. The bird reorganizes itself for the next stage of the journey. For some birds, the margin between success and failure is incredibly thin. The Icelandic whimbrel represents another extreme example of oceanic migration. These small shorebirds make 2 non-stop sea crossings each year between Iceland and West Africa. The round trip is 11,000 kilometers. These are not large birds. They're small, weighing only a few hundred grams. Yet they cross the Atlantic Ocean not once, but twice per year. They fly at speeds up to 24 meters per second, which is the fastest recorded speed for shorebirds flying over ocean. That's more than 85 kilometers per hour, sustained for hours or days. But they often face headwinds that are so strong, they nearly double the effective distance they have to travel through the air. A bird facing a headwind that's equivalent to its ground speed has to fly twice as far to reach its destination. Instead of an 11,000 kilometer journey, it becomes 22,000 kilometers. The bird must have twice as much fuel. Survival depends absolutely on the weather cooperating. Many whimbrels don't survive the journey. Tracking studies have documented birds that turn back, having burned through more fuel than anticipated dealing with headwinds. During bad weather years, especially years with particularly strong opposing winds, mortality rates can reach 25 to 30% of the population. The birds are doing everything right. They're using all their navigation systems correctly. They're preparing properly before departure. They've rebuilt their fat stores. They've optimized their physiology. And yet they still die because the weather doesn't cooperate. The atmosphere shifts. A storm moves in. Wind patterns change. And suddenly birds that were fine become birds that won't make it. Climate change is creating new obstacles that birds haven't evolved to handle. Obstacles that are fundamentally different from the natural challenges they've adapted to over millions of years. For birds that cross the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe, the situation is getting measurably worse every year. The Sahara is expanding northward and southward. Wetlands that birds rely on for stopover sites are drying up due to changing precipitation patterns. The whole geography of stopover sites is shifting. Birds are arriving at their breeding grounds weaker, with less energy reserves for the breeding season, which means lower reproductive success and fewer offspring. Trans-Saharan migrants are particularly vulnerable to these changes because they depend on very specific stopover sites that don't exist anywhere else. There are only so many places where water exists in the middle of the Sahara. Those oases have been there for thousands of years. Birds have evolved to use them. But if changing climate causes those oases to dry up, the entire migration route becomes functionally impossible. There are no backup routes. There are no alternative stopover sites. The birds simply cannot complete the journey. In the East Asian-Australasian Flyway, which is one of the most important migration corridors on the planet, 65% of critical intertidal habitat has been destroyed since the 1950s. Destroyed, not degraded, not impacted, destroyed. The Yellow Sea has lost 65% of its tidal flats, and those flats are irreplaceable stopover habitat for millions of waterbirds that migrate along that route. Spoon-billed sandpipers, which are one of the most endangered birds on Earth, depend on those tidal flats. They lose habitat. Populations decline. It's direct cause and effect. Birds can't adapt quickly. They're locked into migration strategies that evolved over millions of years. They have high site fidelity. They return to the same places year after year, the same stopover sites, the same breeding grounds. If those places disappear, there are no alternatives. The bird's internal compass points to a location that no longer exists. The bird arrives to find barren land where there used to be wetland. The birds starve or fail to breed. The migration system that's been refined over millions of years is suddenly not working anymore. The system breaks down, and birds die. human infrastructure adds a different kind of problem altogether, one that birds have no evolutionary adaptation for. Birds collide with buildings. Modern high-rise buildings with glass facades are invisible to migrating birds. A bird sees the reflection of sky in the glass and flies right into it at full speed. Millions of birds die this way every year in cities alone. Oil platforms out in the ocean attract birds with their lights, disorienting them, causing them to crash into the structures. Wind turbines kill birds that hit the spinning blades. Lights on buildings at night disorient migrating birds. A bird using celestial navigation is confused by ground lights that mimic stars. Light pollution disrupts navigation systems that depend on celestial cues. The night sky that birds have relied on for navigation is increasingly obscured by artificial light. And these are all problems that are increasing in scale as human development spreads. The migration routes that birds follow often cross political boundaries, which means conservation requires international cooperation. A bird breeding in Iceland needs protection in Africa. A bird that spends its summer in Canada needs protection in South America. The red knot breeds in the Arctic, crosses through the United States, and winters in South America. To protect that species requires cooperation from at least 3 countries, possibly more. When migration ranges span 22 countries, as they do in the East Asian-Australasian flyway, coordinating protection becomes politically complicated. Different countries have different environmental regulations. Different countries have different conservation priorities. Some countries prioritize development and economic growth. Some countries prioritize conservation and environmental protection. And birds, meanwhile, don't understand political boundaries. They don't care about international agreements. They don't sign treaties or negotiate with governments. They just follow the routes they've evolved to follow, the routes that have worked for millions of years. And increasingly, those routes lead them into danger. The world has changed so much, so fast, that avian migration systems are now maladapted to the environment they evolved in. But adaptation is precisely what these birds possess. And it starts long before any bird ever attempts an ocean crossing. The physiological preparation is brutal and precise and leaves nothing to chance. Before a bar-tailed godwit even thinks about leaving Alaska, before its brain even registers the urge to migrate, its body begins a transformation that's almost alien in its intensity. The process is called hyperphagia, which is essentially frenzied eating on a controlled schedule. The bird enters a state where food consumption becomes its entire purpose. Every moment not spent flying or resting is spent eating. The bird finds berry patches, seeds, insects, anything rich in calories. It consumes food at a rate that seems impossible for such a small creature. A bird that normally eats a reasonable amount begins consuming food constantly, urgently, obsessively. It's not hunger alone driving this behavior. It's a hormonal change triggered by photoperiod, by the changing length of the day that signals to the bird's brain that migration season is approaching. The body responds to this signal by increasing appetite dramatically. Hunger itself intensifies. The digestive system becomes more efficient. The bird can absorb and process food faster than normal. Calories are extracted with ruthless efficiency and immediately converted to fat tissue. A bird might spend weeks eating nearly continuously, sometimes tripling or quadrupling its normal food intake. The accumulation of fat becomes visible. The bird's body grows heavier, rounder, less aerodynamic. It looks almost bloated. But this is intentional, calculated, and necessary. This fat is fuel. This is the bird's bank account for the journey. Every gram of fat stored is energy that will sustain the bird across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The numbers involved are staggering when you actually calculate them. A bar-tailed godwit might weigh around 190 grams at the beginning of pre-migration feeding, a small bird weighing less than a quarter pound. During the weeks of hyperphagia, it nearly doubles that weight. It can reach 380 to 400 grams. It's almost doubled its body mass in just a few weeks of intensive feeding. For a human equivalent, imagine a 150-pound person doubling their weight to 300 pounds in the span of a month through controlled, deliberate eating. It seems absurd on the face of it. It seems impossible. A human doing this would destroy their metabolism, create serious health problems, end up bedridden from the effort. Yet this is exactly what these birds do routinely, every single year, multiple times during their lifetime, without apparent long-term damage. The metabolic machinery required to process that much food, to convert it to usable energy storage, is extraordinary. The digestive system essentially becomes a factory. The bird's liver grows to handle increased metabolic load. The pancreas works overtime producing digestive enzymes and hormones. The digestive tract becomes hyperactive, moving food through faster, extracting calories more efficiently. Every organ involved in food processing is running at maximum capacity. It's like the bird's entire body becomes a food processing machine for a few weeks. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the feeding ends and the bird becomes a flying machine. What's remarkable is the timing of this feeding. It's not random or continuous throughout the year. It's concentrated into specific windows before migration actually begins. The bird knows the schedule. It knows when migration is coming. The photoperiod triggers the change. Days getting shorter in autumn or longer in spring sends a signal to the brain. Hormones shift. Appetite increases. The feeding window typically lasts several weeks before departure. During this period, the bird is in a state of almost constant food searching and consumption. Then, when conditions align correctly, when internal signals indicate migration should begin, the feeding ends. The bird stops eating. The urge to migrate becomes irresistible. The bird has accumulated sufficient fat reserves, and now it's time to leave. But here's something counterintuitive and deeply interesting. About 3 weeks before migration actually begins, before the feeding window closes and the bird prepares to depart, the bird actually decreases its metabolism. It slows its body down. It burns fewer calories at rest. This metabolic reduction might seem to work against the hyperphagia, but it's actually complementary. By lowering resting metabolic rate, the bird conserves energy during the pre-migration period. It's preparing for the massive effort ahead by tuning its metabolism. The body is doing less work to maintain baseline function, which means more of the food being consumed is converted directly to fat storage rather than being burned for daily maintenance. Studies using small sensors on birds have documented this effect. Migrating blackbirds showed measurable decreases in metabolism 3 weeks before departure. The energy savings from this metabolic adjustment are substantial, potentially rivaling or exceeding the energy cost of the actual migratory flights themselves. The bird is being incredibly strategic about energy management. It's not just eating more, it's restructuring how its body uses energy. It's lowering expenditure while simultaneously increasing intake. The efficiency of the system is remarkable. Different bird species accumulate different amounts of fat depending on their migration distance and strategy. A bird making a shorter migration, a few hundred kilometers across familiar territory with potential stopover sites, might accumulate modest fat reserves, maybe 20 to 30% additional weight. A bird attempting a non-stop 12,000-kilometer crossing with no opportunity to rest or refuel must accumulate enormous reserves, sometimes doubling or nearly tripling its normal weight. The bar-tailed godwit basically has to become a flying fuel tank. The proportion of body weight that's fat can reach extreme levels. Some birds might be 50% fat by weight by the time they're ready to depart. Half of the bird's entire body weight is stored energy. Imagine that for a human. A person whose 50% body fat would be essentially immobile. essentially non-functional. A 150-pound human with 50% body fat would have 75 pounds of fat, and the remaining 75 pounds would be distributed among organs, bones, water, and muscle. That person would not be able to move. But birds have a different body composition naturally. They're already extremely lean animals with high metabolic rates and efficient muscle-to-weight ratios. Adding fat to this lean frame produces an animal that's heavy and somewhat ungainly, but still capable of flight. The fat sits beneath the skin and inside the body cavity, adding weight but not changing the fundamental structure. The bird looks rounder, puffier, but its wings are still functional. Its cardiovascular system is still capable. It can still fly, even with all that extra weight. The stored fat is metabolized differently at different stages of the journey. Early in a flight, when the bird has just taken off and is still relatively fresh, it burns fat at a steady rate. But as the flight continues, as fatigue sets in and the bird approaches the limits of its endurance, the body becomes even more efficient at extracting energy from fat. The bird enters a state of extreme fat metabolism. It's like the body has a dial, and it can turn up fat utilization to maximum levels. Some studies suggest that by the end of a long flight, a bird might be deriving 97% of its energy from fat, with less than 3% coming from protein. The body is operating in pure conservation mode, using the absolute minimum amount of energy to keep the wings moving and the heart beating. The weight loss during flight is dramatic and measurable. A bar-tailed godwit that departed Alaska at 400 grams arrives in New Zealand at around 200 grams. It has lost half its body weight. Half. The fat is gone. The protein reserves have been partially catabolized. The bird has been stripped down to something barely more than muscle and bone and the absolutely essential organs required for survival. The transformation is profound. The bird that took off as a round, heavy, somewhat ungainly creature arrives lean and depleted. It looks different. It looks desperate. Because it is. By the time it lands, assuming it successfully completes the journey, the bird is at the absolute edge of survival. A day or two without food now would be fatal. The fat reserves are exhausted. The bird must eat immediately upon arrival or die. But before any of this metabolic intensity, before any of this fuel preparation, the bird's body must undergo complete structural reorganization. The organs themselves must change. The bird can't carry a digestive system designed for processing food across an ocean where no food will be consumed. It's dead weight. Literally, it's weight that doesn't serve the journey. So the bird's body resorbs it. The digestive organs shrink significantly. The stomach shrinks. The intestines reduce in size. The entire digestive tract becomes smaller and less metabolically active. Why? Because these organs won't be needed. The bird won't be eating during the journey. There's no point carrying around a digestive system designed for processing food when the plan is to not eat for 10 days. So the body breaks down these organs, resorbs the protein, and uses that protein as fuel or for other purposes. It's resourceful. It's ruthless. It's efficient beyond comprehension. The liver, which in normal circumstances handles metabolic processing and nutrient storage, actually shrinks before migration. The bird's body is preparing for a state of near hibernation, a state where the bird will be powered almost entirely by stored fat and will have minimal metabolic needs beyond flight. The liver doesn't need to be large. The kidneys don't need to be as active. These organs that would normally be working hard are put into a kind of economical mode. Their size decreases. Their metabolic activity decreases. Their mass decreases. Every gram that's not essential to flight and survival is either removed or minimized. The bird is sculpting itself into a flying machine optimized for distance and endurance. Meanwhile, the organs that matter for flight are growing and strengthening. The flight muscles grow substantially, sometimes increasing by 30 to 50% in mass. The pectoral muscles, which power the wings, increase in mass and density. These muscles become incredibly strong and efficient at extracting energy from fuel. They develop the ability to sustain contraction for hours without fatigue, without weakness, without degradation. The muscle fibers themselves change at a cellular level. They become loaded with mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, increasing the number of energy-producing organelles available to extract ATP from fuel molecules. This cellular level change means the muscles can extract more energy from fat and sustain longer periods of intense activity. The heart GR out's larger, sometimes increasing by 20 to 30%. A larger heart can pump more blood with each beat, more efficiently and more powerfully. The bird's cardiovascular system becomes supercharged in ways that are measurable and dramatic. Blood vessels proliferate through the flight muscles, creating a more dense network of capillaries, ensuring maximum oxygen delivery during sustained flight. The bird is building itself into an endurance machine in the most literal sense. The changes are visible if you were to dissect a bird before and after pre-migration conditioning. The muscle density is noticeably different under magnification. The cardiovascular system is noticeably more developed with larger chambers and thicker walls. The organs are noticeably smaller, compacted, reduced. It's like comparing a sedentary person to an elite endurance athlete. The transformation is profound. And then there are the reproductive organs. During migration, reproduction is not a priority. In fact, it's a liability. Reproductive organs consume energy and add mass. So they shrink. They become metabolically quiet. They're essentially put on hold until the bird reaches its destination and can focus on breeding. This shrinking of reproductive organs is triggered by photoperiod, just like the feeding is. But it's the opposite direction. As day length decreases moving into fall migration, reproductive organs shrink. As day length increases moving into spring migration, reproductive organs are already regressed from the previous breeding season and are preparing to regrow. The bird's entire biology is synchronized to seasonal changes in light. The photoperiod is a clock that coordinates all of these physiological events. The bird doesn't need a calendar. The sun itself provides the timing signal. Before the bird ever takes off, its skeleton itself has changed. The bones become denser in some ways, more brittle in others, optimized for sustained flight. The structure of the wing becomes finely tuned. Every feather is replaced or maintained in perfect condition. Damaged feathers are molted and regrown. The plumage must be absolutely pristine because damaged feathers reduce aerodynamic efficiency. Even a small increase in drag, multiplied across thousands of kilometers, becomes a significant energy penalty. So the bird invests in feather condition. Feathers are maintained with obsessive care. The bird spends hours preening, aligning feathers, waterproofing them with oils from a special gland. The plumage is functional armor, and it must be perfect. The transformation is complete. The bird is no longer a normal organism going about normal daily tasks. It's a specialized machine built for one purpose. Every system in the body has been restructured to support flight across an ocean. The bird is ready. It's maximally prepared. But preparation alone isn't enough. The bird still has to actually do the thing. It still has to leave the ground and fly for thousands of kilometers over water. The moment the bar-tailed godwit takes off from the Alaskan coast, once the wings begin beating and the bird launches into the air, it enters a state unlike anything most organisms ever experience. The bird is now burning energy at a rate more than 10 times its resting metabolic rate. To visualize this, imagine a human being running at absolute maximum sprint speed continuously for 9 days and nights without stopping. without resting, without slowing even slightly. Imagine sprinting, not for minutes or hours, but for days and days without stopping, your heart pounding at maximum rate, your muscles screaming, your lungs burning, every second of it an extreme effort. This is what the bar-tailed godwit is doing, sustained over thousands of kilometers. The metabolic cost is staggering beyond easy comprehension. The physiological stress is extreme in ways that seem almost impossible for such a small creature to survive. The bird's body is essentially at war with entropy, using stored chemical energy to hold itself up in the air against gravity for hundreds of hours continuously. The physics alone is demanding. A small bird with relatively low surface area to weight ratio is trying to stay aloft using muscle power alone. No engines, no propellers, no technology, just muscle contracting repeatedly, wing beating thousands of times per hour. Every wing beat requires energy. Every second of flight requires continuous expenditure from dwindling fuel reserves. There's no rest. There's no break. The bird cannot afford to stop, even for a moment. If it stops, if the wings stop beating, it falls. If it falls into the ocean far from land with no way to take off again, it dies. So it continues. It keeps flying. The alternative is death. The fuel strategy becomes more sophisticated once the flight actually begins. Early in the journey, when the bird is still fresh and its internal organs are still active, the bird uses a mixed fuel strategy. Protein is being catabolized for multiple reasons. Protein metabolism generates water, and the bird needs water even though it cannot drink from the salt water below. Protein also contains amino acids necessary for maintaining muscle and organ function. So in the first hour or hours of flight, about 30% of the bird's energy comes from protein. The bird is burning muscle and organ tissue deliberately to access amino acids and generate water. But once the body adjusts to sustained flight, once the bird settles into a rhythm and hours pass without resting, the protein contribution drops dramatically. By the time the bird has been flying for a few hours and enters the rhythm of sustained flight, protein is contributing less than 3% of energy. The bird is running almost entirely on fat. The fat reserves are being metabolized at an enormous rate, but in a controlled and efficient way. The challenge of navigation during this flight is severe. The bird is navigating across a featureless ocean where there are no landmarks. For hours and days, the bird sees nothing but water in all directions. There are no reference points. There's no visible sign of progress. The bird must maintain heading using internal compasses, using magnetic sense, using whatever celestial cues are available through clouds or darkness. The bird cannot see where it's going in any conventional sense. It's flying toward a destination it cannot see, cannot smell, cannot sense, except through internal mechanisms. And if the bird's navigation is off by just a small amount, if wind pushes it a few degrees off course, the margin of error is minimal. Miss New Zealand by 100 kilometers, and there's nothing to land on. Just more ocean. Just more water. The bird will continue flying until fuel runs out. Then it will fall. The navigation has to be absolutely precise. The bird cannot afford to be wrong. Weather becomes a critical hazard during these crossings. A storm at sea is dangerous enough for ships with engines and hulls and crew. For a small bird flying on stored fat reserves, a storm is catastrophic. Wind shear can physically damage the bird. Rain can soak feathers and destroy their insulating and waterproofing properties. Hail can cause injury. But worse than physical damage is the energy cost. A bird flying into a headwind that's strong enough consumes energy at double the rate of flying in calm conditions. A strong headwind can make an 11,000 kilometer journey into a 22,000 kilometer journey. The bird can't skip the wind. It can't wait it out. It has to fly through it. It has to burn extra fuel to make progress against the wind. If the headwind is too strong and persists too long, the bird's fuel runs out before it reaches land. The bird dies. Tracking data from migrating birds shows that some individuals do encounter such weather. Some birds turn back before completing the journey, having burned through more fuel than anticipated dealing with adverse conditions. These birds make it back to land. Other birds don't turn back. They press forward, they commit to the route, and when fuel runs out over open ocean, they die. The mortality rate during these ocean crossings is not zero. Estimates suggest that 20 to 30% of migrating birds die during their journeys. Some years are worse than others depending on weather patterns. Some years are better. But in bad weather years, mortality can exceed 30%. This is the reality of ocean crossing for a bird. It's not a guaranteed survival. It's a calculated risk. The bird has prepared as much as possible. The bird has accumulated fuel. The bird has developed the physical capacity for sustained flight. But the environment doesn't care about preparation. A storm doesn't care about how much fat the bird's stored. A headwind doesn't respect the bird's evolutionary adaptation. The bird is ultimately gambling. It's betting that conditions will be favorable. It's betting that its navigation will be accurate. It's betting that nothing will go catastrophically wrong. And sometimes the bet doesn't pay off. The crossing of an ocean is matched in difficulty by the crossing of a desert. For birds attempting to reach African and European breeding grounds from southern wintering areas, the Sahara Desert represents an obstacle that's almost as unforgiving as an ocean. The desert is vast, almost entirely barren, with almost no water and almost no food. A bird flying across the Sahara might see nothing but sand and rock for thousands of kilometers. There's nowhere to land and rest. There are few places to find water or food. The environment is actively hostile. Temperatures can be extreme. During the day, the heat shimmers off sand and distorts vision. During the night, temperatures can drop significantly. Dust storms can obscure landmarks and confuse navigation systems. The Sahara is almost as challenging as an ocean, just with sand instead of water. Birds crossing the Sahara depend on a narrow corridor of stopover sites, critical locations that have been used for millennia, oases where water exists and plants grow, wetlands that have managed to persist despite the aridity through complicated groundwater dynamics and local climate factors. These sites are scattered across thousands of kilometers of desert, separated by vast stretches of completely barren landscape. They're not common, they're not abundant. They're rare and precious. A bird migrating through the Sahara might fly for a full day, sometimes longer, before encountering suitable habitat for rest and refueling. The bird flies across endless sand, watching fuel reserves deplete, looking for any sign of green vegetation or water. The physiological stress is immense. The bird's body is being pushed to absolute limits. And then finally, after hours or even a day of flying over barren desert, the bird sees green, an oasis, a wetland, a location where rest and food are available. But if that oasis is dried up, if conditions have changed, if the water level has dropped because of drought or groundwater extraction upstream, the bird faces a crisis. There's nowhere else to land nearby. The bird has exhausted hours of flying time and then finds nothing. The bird has to either continue flying on severely depleted reserves, hoping desperately to find another stopover site before complete fuel exhaustion, or die in the desert. Climate change is making the Sahara crossings more difficult every year in ways that are measurable and alarming. The desert is expanding northward and southward, pushing into areas that used to be marginally habitable. Oases are drying up as precipitation patterns shift from historical norms. Rainfall that used to arrive reliably at specific times is now erratic and often absent. Wetlands that have been used as stopover sites for thousands of years, locations that have supported migrating birds generation after generation, are disappearing. Not degrading, disappearing. Birds navigate using internal maps that were accurate for millennia. Those maps point to specific locations. The bird's internal GPS says water is here, food is here, rest is here. But when the bird arrives at the coordinates, when it reaches the location where the map says a wetland should be, it finds nothing but dried earth, cracked mud, dead vegetation. The stopover site that evolved over millennia to support migrating birds is gone, just gone, evaporated. The birds must either find an alternative stopover site or die. And finding an alternative site when you're already depleted and desperate and flying on fumes is often impossible. The Mediterranean Sea represents a second major ocean crossing for birds migrating between Africa and Europe. These two crossings, the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea, form a gauntlet that birds must pass through twice per year, once in spring heading north and once in fall heading south. A bird might barely survive a grueling Sahara crossing, arriving at the Mediterranean coast depleted and desperate for rest. But there's only a narrow window of time for recovery. The breeding season is approaching. The bird must move north to reach breeding grounds at the right time. There's no time for extended rest. The bird refuels as quickly as possible and faces the Mediterranean crossing. This is exhaustion compounded by time pressure, compounded by a second major ecological barrier. The bird is being pushed to absolute limits. And beyond those limits, beyond what the bird's physiology can sustain, climate change is actively working to make the situation worse. Temperature increases are causing earlier spring migrations. Birds are responding to warming temperatures and changing photoperiod by leaving wintering grounds earlier than in the past. They're arriving at breeding grounds earlier. But food availability, the peak production of insects and seeds that birds depend on, is not shifting at the same rate. The food is emerging and peaking at slightly different times than the birds are arriving. This is a mismatch, a phenological mismatch. The bird arrives ready to breed and feed young, but the food isn't quite ready yet. The bird must wait or must find suboptimal food sources. Either way, breeding success is reduced. Fewer offspring are produced. Fewer young survive to adulthood. The population doesn't grow, it declines. This mismatch is increasing in severity. Different species are showing different rates of change in migration timing. Climate change is affecting temperature and photoperiod at different rates in different locations. A bird breeding ground might be warming faster than a wintering ground, or the rate of photoperiod change is different. The signals that used to synchronize perfectly are now out of sync. The entire migration system, refined over millions of years, is being disrupted by changes happening on a decadal timescale. Some of the most critical stopover sites for birds migrating through Asia are disappearing at an alarming rate. The Yellow Sea tidal flats, which have supported millions of water birds for millennia, have been destroyed 65% since the 1950s. 65% gone. Converted to agriculture, to industrial development, to ports and cities. Birds dependent on those tidal flats for stopover habitat now face a crisis. The spoon-billed sandpiper, one of the world's most endangered birds, depends on those Yellow Sea tidal flats. With 65% of that habitat gone, the bird's survival is increasingly tenuous. There are other stopover sites used by these birds, but they're not equivalent. A bird's migration route evolved over countless generations. The stopover sites along that route are specific. They're optimized for that route. A bird can't just find an alternative stopover site 100 kilometers away and consider the problem solved. The bird might not know about that alternative site. The bird's navigation system might not lead to it. The bird's internal programming might be pointing to a location that no longer exists. The bird arrives and finds nothing. Then what? The bird has to either continue flying on depleted reserves or die trying. The conservation implications are dire. Habitat loss at critical stopover sites creates bottlenecks. Birds begin to die en masse when they reach those locations and find them destroyed. Populations can collapse. A species can go from stable to critically endangered in a few years if key stopover habitat is destroyed. The Delaware Bay represents one of the last remaining critical stopover sites that's still relatively intact, though even it faces threats from coastal development and climate change. This shallow bay on the Atlantic coast of the United States has become a crucial refueling point for millions of shorebirds migrating between Arctic breeding grounds and South American wintering grounds. The red knot depends on the Delaware Bay with an intensity that's almost absolute, almost religious in its precision and necessity. These small shorebirds arrive in the bay depleted from weeks of flight, sometimes after crossing the Atlantic directly from South America, or after flying up the coast from Caribbean wintering grounds. They're exhausted, their fat reserves are minimal, nearly depleted from the long flight. Their flight muscles have been partially catabolized, broken down into amino acids, and used as fuel during the journey. The birds are at critical weight, below optimal levels for survival, dangerously close to the point where continued flight becomes impossible. In the Delaware Bay, they must refuel. They must find food and restore their reserves quickly before continuing north. The food that's available depends on timing synchronized over millions of years. Horseshoe crabs come ashore to spawn in the bay, typically in May, following ancient breeding cycles. They lay millions of eggs in the sand, creating an abundance of nutrition in a concentrated area. Those eggs are incredibly nutritious, rich in fats and proteins, exactly what a depleted migrating bird needs to survive. The red knots time their migration to arrive at the Delaware Bay, exactly when the horseshoe crabs are spawning. The eggs are exposed and abundant for only a brief window. The birds descend on the area and feed voraciously, consuming thousands of eggs per bird per day, sometimes eating more than their own body weight in eggs. In a few weeks of intense feeding, the birds rebuild fat reserves from near empty to optimal levels. Their weight increases. They're ready for the next leg of migration. They fly north to Arctic breeding grounds strengthened by Delaware Bay refueling, prepared for breeding season. This synchronization is one of the most precise in nature. A horseshoe crab and a shorebird evolved on completely different continents. They have almost no interaction except for a few weeks per year when their life cycles intersect, yet they've synchronized so precisely that it's almost implausible. The horseshoe crab spawns. The knots arrive. The food is exactly what they need, at exactly the time they need it. This is an evolutionary relationship that's been refined over tens of thousands of years. Both species have adapted to this synchronization, and if the synchronization breaks, if the timing shifts, if the horseshoe crabs spawn too early or too late, the knots suffer. Breeding success drops, mortality increases, populations decline. The fragility of these stopover relationships is something that becomes increasingly apparent as we understand how dependent birds are on these critical locations. A single bay, a single tidal flat, a single oasis in a desert can support the survival of millions of birds across an entire region. If that location is destroyed or degraded, if its habitat value is reduced, the entire migration system breaks down. Birds cannot easily adapt to habitat loss. They cannot find alternatives quickly. They cannot reprogram their internal navigation systems to point to new stopover sites. Evolution takes millions of years. Birds are facing habitat loss on a timescale of decades. The mismatch is profound. Yet even with all this vulnerability and all these obstacles and all these threats, some birds keep doing it. Some birds have been making these journeys for thousands of years, and they continue now, adapting, struggling, but persisting. The Arctic tern lives in a world that most creatures would find incomprehensible. The bird is small, weighing maybe 100 grams, yet this fragile creature undertakes a journey that's almost mythical in its scope. The Arctic tern is not a large raptor. It's a delicate seabird, built for efficiency rather than strength. It doesn't look like it should be capable of crossing oceans, and yet it does, repeatedly, throughout its entire life. The Arctic tern migrates from Arctic breeding grounds in places like Greenland and the northern Canadian Arctic, where summer ice melts and food abundance emerges briefly. The bird nests there, breeds there, raises young there in the perpetual daylight of the Arctic summer. Then, as the season shifts and food becomes scarcer, the bird prepares. It feeds frantically, accumulating fat reserves. The transformation happens quickly. The bird's weight increases. Internal organs shift and reorganize. And then the bird leaves, flying to the opposite end of the Earth. The Arctic tern migrates from the Arctic to the Antarctic, the longest migration of any bird species, sometimes exceeding 90,000 kilometers annually. A bird that weighs 100 grams travels 90,000 kilometers every year. The bird essentially experiences 2 summers in a single year, spending the northern summer in the Arctic and the southern summer in Antarctic waters. This means the bird witnesses more daylight annually than any other creature on the planet. It literally chases perpetual summer from pole to pole, always seeking the season of abundance and food. As soon as breeding season ends in the Arctic, the bird leaves. It doesn't stop for months. It travels across the equator and tropics until it reaches Antarctica. And then, as that summer ends, the bird does it again in reverse. By the time it returns to Arctic breeding grounds, it has experienced 2 summers and skipped 2 winters entirely. One Arctic tern, banded as a chick on the Farne Islands off the British East Coast, travelled to Australia in just 3 months, more than 22,000 kilometres across open ocean. Another bird, tracked with a geolocator tag, covered 96,000 kilometres in 10 months, more than twice around the Earth's circumference. This bird didn't fly in a straight line. It took detours to capitalise on global wind patterns. The route took the bird across the Atlantic, down the African coast, across the Indian Ocean, partway across the South Pacific to Antarctica, then westward along the Antarctic coast and back up the Atlantic. The entire route was a spiral, a calculated path that took advantage of seasonal wind patterns. The Arctic tern was optimizing not for speed, but for energy efficiency. The bird was burning less fuel by taking a longer route that offered better atmospheric conditions. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But the most fuel-efficient route is not always the shortest. If you can fly an extra 1,000 kilometers while using less fuel because you're riding favorable winds, that's a net gain. You save energy overall. Your survival odds improve. This knowledge has been encoded into the bird's navigation system. The Arctic tern's journey reveals something fundamental about migration strategy. It's not about the shortest distance, it's about the most survivable route. The bird will fly extra thousands of kilometers if it means facing fewer headwinds, if it means accessing better food at stopovers, if it means using rising air currents that reduce the energy cost of flight. These birds have evolved to read the atmosphere, to understand where the winds blow most favorably, and to plan routes that exploit that knowledge. The knowledge is not conscious. The bird doesn't think about meteorology. The bird doesn't consult maps. The bird just flies, and its internal programming guides it toward routes that experience has shown over millions of years to be most survivable. Young Arctic terns do this on their first migration, without any parent guidance. The routes are genetically encoded. The birds simply know where to go. They know which winds to use. They know which stopovers will have food. They know because millions of years of evolutionary history have encoded this knowledge into their brains, into their navigation systems, into their very biology. A young Arctic tern, raising itself after its parents depart, never having made this migration before, somehow still finds its way to Antarctica and then returns the following year to the same breeding location. It's almost as if the bird was born with a map, born with knowledge of where to fly. The truth is, stranger and more sophisticated. The bird was born with genetic programming that allows it to interpret cues in the environment, to follow winds, to read stars, to respond to magnetic fields, and to synthesize all of this information into coherent navigation. The routes are not consciously learned, they're genetically inherited. The Arctic tern spends its entire life in motion. It's one of the most mobile creatures on the planet. A single bird might, over its lifetime, fly more than 2 million kilometers. That's almost 50 times around the Earth's circumference. It might cross an ocean 100 times, more than 100 times. It might navigate using stars and magnetic fields and wind patterns thousands upon thousands of times. Every night, every day, the bird is flying. Every meal is eaten in flight or at brief landings. The bird nests for a few months per year in the Arctic. Then it leaves. It doesn't return for months. It breeds in Antarctic waters, if breeding is even possible there, which it's not, so instead it just feeds and rests and then begins the journey back. The bird lives almost entirely in transit, between two poles, following the sun as it circles the Earth. It's following a rhythm as old as the rotation of the planet itself. But the Arctic tern's dominance of the migration record has been challenged by other birds whose journeys, while shorter in total distance, are in some ways even more extreme. The bar-tailed godwit holds the record for the longest non-stop flight of any bird. This small shorebird, weighing perhaps 200 grams at its normal body weight, is not built for anything extreme. It's designed for walking along beaches, for probing into sand for invertebrates, for life in shallow water. It's a humble bird, unimpressive to look at, easy to overlook. Yet this unassuming creature accomplishes something that seems physically impossible. It launches from Alaska and flies directly toward New Zealand without stopping, without resting, without eating. No breaks, no landings, no brief moments of respite. The flight covers approximately 11,000 kilometers. The bird flies across the entire Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean on the planet. It takes roughly 9 to 10 days of continuous flight. The bird does not land. It does not rest its wings even for an hour. It does not eat. It simply flies continuously for over a week. Imagine running at maximum effort for 9 days without stopping. Imagine sprinting for 9 days. Your muscles would be destroyed. Your energy would be depleted. You would die. But this small bird does this using only the energy stored in its body as fat. Before the flight, the bird has prepared by nearly doubling its body weight. A 190-gram bird arrives at Alaska and begins eating obsessively. Weeks of frenzied feeding follow. The bird visits beaches and mudflats constantly, eating invertebrates, worms, and small crustaceans. The bird's weight climbs steadily. It reaches 250 grams, then 300, then 350. By the time the bird is ready for its Pacific crossing, it has reached 350 to 400 grams. nearly doubling its normal body weight. It becomes visibly rounder, heavier, less aerodynamic, but those extra grams are pure fuel, the energy that will power the Pacific crossing. Every gram has a purpose. The bar-tailed godwit faces conditions that make the Arctic tern's migration seem manageable by comparison. The Pacific crossing is non-stop. There are essentially no stopover sites in the middle. New Zealand exists at the end, and Alaska at the beginning. In between, there's nothing but open water. The bird must navigate across a featureless expanse using only internal compasses, stars, magnetic field, and its internal mental map. The margin for error is minimal. A navigation error of a few degrees can mean missing the destination entirely. If the bird arrives where New Zealand should be and finds only more ocean, it continues flying with no fuel left until the wings can no longer beat. Then it falls into the ocean. The bird dies. Tracking studies have documented bar-tailed godwits encountering severe weather during Pacific crossings. Headwinds slow progress. Storms require the bird to expend extra energy. Rain soaks feathers. Some birds turn back when conditions become too severe. Other birds press forward, gambling that fuel will hold out. Sometimes the gamble pays off, sometimes it doesn't. Mortality during Pacific crossings reaches 25 to 30% in bad weather years. A quarter to a third of the birds attempting the crossing don't make it. The survivors that reach New Zealand lose half their body weight during the journey. It arrives at roughly 200 grams, stripped down to nearly nothing. The fat reserves are completely gone. The muscle has been partially catabolized. The bird's body has consumed parts of itself to stay alive. It's at absolute minimum weight for survival. It must eat immediately or die. If there's no food available, the bird has perhaps another week before starvation becomes fatal. The return flight from New Zealand to Alaska takes just 7 days versus 9 to 10 days on the outbound flight, likely due to favorable wind patterns. The bird flies at speeds approaching 65 kilometers per hour, sustained for days. The bird is the fastest non-stop flyer of any bird species. The bird is driven to return by the urgency of breeding season. Alaska is approaching spring. The breeding window is narrowing. The bar-tailed godwit's Pacific crossing represents the absolute edge of what avian physiology can accomplish. The flight is only possible because of the specific fuel storage capacity, the specific efficiency of metabolism, and the specific accuracy of navigation systems. All these systems have to work together perfectly. Change any of these variables, and the flight becomes impossible. The bird is perfectly adapted for this single, extreme task. Everything about it is optimized for crossing the Pacific Ocean twice per year. Beyond these superlative journeys, there are countless other remarkable migrations that don't hold records, but are equally remarkable. The Manx shearwater migrates 14,000 kilometers between northern breeding grounds in the North Atlantic and southern wintering grounds in the South Atlantic, crossing twice per year for its entire life. A single Manx shearwater might live over 50 years and cover 8 million kilometers, equivalent to traveling to the moon and back more than 10 times. The bird spends essentially its entire life in transit. The red knot makes annual migrations of up to 15,000 kilometers from Arctic breeding grounds to Tierra del Fuego. These small shorebirds depend absolutely on specific stopover sites, particularly Delaware Bay, where horseshoe crabs come ashore to spawn. The red knot arrives depleted and feeds frantically on horseshoe crab eggs for weeks, rebuilding reserves from near empty to optimal. The synchronization is precise and ancient. The horseshoe crabs spawn following a rhythm unchanged for millions of years. The red knots arrive, guided by internal clocks that know date and location with precision. The eggs are available at exactly the moment the birds need them. This relationship between two completely different lineages has been refined to absolute precision. The songbirds that cross the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea undertake journeys that are less extreme in distance, but more extreme in their percentage of body weight loss. These small warblers, weighing just 10 to 20 grams, are tiny. A single grape weighs more than one of these birds. Yet they cross the Sahara, a journey of 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers with almost no stopover sites. The desert is empty. It's thousands of kilometers of sand and heat and wind, with essentially nowhere to land and rest. The birds must fly continuously, and they fly at low altitude, trying desperately to find oases, trying desperately to find any vegetation or water source. They lose 50% of their body weight during this crossing. A 15-gram bird arrives at the other side weighing 7 to 8 grams, essentially a skeleton with feathers. They're stripped down to skin and bone, dependent on immediate access to food. If they can't find food upon arrival on the other side of the desert, they will die within days. Many don't survive the crossing. Mortality rates for Sahara crossings reach 50% or higher. Half the birds attempting the journey die. For certain populations, in certain years, mortality can reach 70 or 80%. The birds that do survive experience something called barrier crossing behavior, where they fly at extremely low altitudes over desert, sometimes just meters above the sand, trying desperately to find any vegetation, any water, any food source that might sustain them through the crossing. The Icelandic whimbrel crosses the Atlantic Ocean twice per year between Iceland and West Africa, making 2 non-stop sea crossings of over 5,500 kilometers each. These small shorebirds are built for speed. They fly at speeds up to 24 meters per second, making them the fastest shorebirds ever recorded flying over ocean. Yet they face Atlantic headwinds so strong that they nearly double the effective distance they must fly through the air. A headwind of 24 meters per second, equal to the bird's forward speed, means the bird must fly twice as far to reach the same destination. The bird is essentially flying into a wall of wind. It's expending double the energy just to make progress against the wind. The wind is pushing back with force equal to the bird's maximum flying speed. These journeys, taken collectively, paint a picture of avian migration that's almost incomprehensible in its extremism. These are not comfortable journeys. These are not easy flights. These are desperate gambles with survival odds that would be unacceptable to any other species. No mammal would attempt what these birds attempt. No reptile could. No human certainly could. Yet birds do this. They do this every year, every generation, without hesitation, without apparent doubt. They do this because the alternative is death. A bird that didn't migrate north to breeding grounds would miss breeding season. A bird that didn't migrate south to wintering grounds would starve when winter arrived. Migration is not optional. It's not a choice. It's survival. The evolutionary history that produced these extraordinary migrations is itself remarkable and alien in its timescale. We're talking about timescales measured in millions of years. Birds did not always migrate. Migration is not a universal characteristic of avian species. Some birds don't migrate at all. They're resident species, staying in one location year-round. These are usually birds adapted to tropical regions, where food availability is relatively consistent throughout the year, where seasons are less pronounced. Other birds migrate only locally, moving from higher elevations to lower elevations seasonally to follow food availability. They might spend the summer in the mountains where food is abundant during the growing season, then descend to valleys for winter. The distances involved are relatively small. Still others make the extreme intercontinental migrations we've been discussing, traveling thousands of kilometers between hemispheres. Migration appears to have evolved gradually from more local movement patterns. The fossil record doesn't preserve migration behavior directly because behavior doesn't fossilize. You can't look at a bird's skeleton and definitively determine whether that bird migrated or stayed resident. But the anatomy of birds and the distribution of living species provides clues about evolutionary history. Seabirds appear to have evolved migration behavior before land birds did. Albatrosses and petrels, ancient families of seabirds with lineages dating back 40 million years or more, show evidence of long-distance migration in living species. These birds cross entire oceans. They circle continents. The oldest known seabird fossils suggest that pelagic flight and long-distance movement were characteristics of early seabirds. The ability to fly over water and navigate long distances was present very early in avian evolution. Land birds evolved migration later, some families showing evidence of migration dating back perhaps 10 to 30 million years, while other families never evolved migration at all. Some passerine families, the songbirds, appear to have evolved migration relatively recently, perhaps within the last few million years, with different populations of the same species showing different migratory patterns. The driving force behind the evolution of migration was almost certainly seasonal food availability combined with the ability to move. In temperate and polar regions, winter is a season of extreme scarcity. Food doesn't just decrease, it essentially disappears. Insects die or enter dormancy. Berries are consumed by the first birds and mammals that find them. Water freezes solid. Remaining food sources become extremely limited, so limited that a bird staying year-round would face starvation within weeks. But a bird that could leave, that could travel to a location where winter didn't occur, that could exploit food resources at a different latitude where food was still abundant, could survive the season. The evolutionary advantage of migration is straightforward and unambiguous. Birds that migrated survived winter and reproduced successfully. Birds that didn't migrate starved to death or failed to reproduce because they lacked the energy for breeding. Over thousands of generations, migration became encoded into the genetic programming of certain species. Not all species, just those in seasonal environments where the advantage was clear and unambiguous. The ability to respond to photoperiod changes, to recognize migration season by noticing changes in day length, to accumulate fat reserves efficiently, to navigate long distances accurately, to synchronize arrival with food availability at distant locations, these capabilities accumulated through natural selection. A bird with slightly better navigation was more likely to find its destination and survive, so it was more likely to reproduce and pass on genes for better navigation. A bird with slightly more efficient fat metabolism could accomplish the migration with less total fuel required, so it was more likely to complete the journey and reach breeding grounds, so it reproduced more successfully. A bird that accumulated slightly more fat reserves before migration was more likely to complete the journey without starving mid-route, and was therefore more likely to reproduce. Generation after generation, these traits accumulated. Migration became more efficient, more precise, more successful. The system became refined. The evolution of navigation systems was particularly complex and is still not fully understood today. Early migrating birds probably relied on simple directional cues. They followed the sun. They recognized landscape features. They moved in response to seasonal changes. Over evolutionary time, more sophisticated navigation systems evolved through natural selection. The ability to sense magnetic fields is ancient, appearing in some of the most primitive life forms on Earth. Bacteria can sense magnetic fields using magnetite proteins. Some fish can sense magnetic fields. Some reptiles can sense magnetic fields. Birds inherited this capability from ancestral forms and refined it over millions of years. developing specialized proteins in the eye that can detect magnetic field orientation with remarkable precision. This quantum biological mechanism is so sophisticated that it appears to involve quantum mechanics itself. The process involves special proteins called cryptochromes that generate quantum particles in response to blue light. And these quantum particles interact with Earth's magnetic field in ways that scientists are only now beginning to understand. The sophistication of this system suggests that magnetic navigation evolved over hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution. The evolution of celestial navigation involved developing an internal clock, a circadian timing system that could compensate for the apparent movement of the sun and stars throughout the year. The sun moves across the sky in a predictable pattern that changes throughout the year. A bird in June sees the sun at a different angle in the sky than in December. The constellations rotate around Polaris in the northern hemisphere throughout the night. A bird needs to account for these changes to use the sun or stars for navigation. Young birds appear to be born with an instinctive knowledge of the constellations, the ability to recognize stellar patterns without ever having seen them before. This knowledge is not learned. It's not taught. It's genetically encoded, passed down through millions of years of evolutionary history. The genes that encode stellar navigation are ancient. The neural circuits in the bird's brain that process star patterns are laid down during development. The knowledge is built in. The evolution of mental maps is perhaps the most mysterious aspect of avian navigation and remains not fully understood by scientists. Birds somehow encode geographic information into their brains. They can remember locations they've never visited before. They can navigate to destinations that are thousands of kilometers away and that they've never seen with their eyes. A young Arctic tern doesn't inherit knowledge of Antarctica's location from its parents through instruction. The bird's brain contains something like an internal map that points toward Antarctica. How this information is encoded is genuinely mysterious. The brain of a migrating bird must contain something like a map, something that allows the bird to understand where it is relative to where it needs to go. The resolution of this map appears to be quite good. Birds can navigate with accuracy measured in kilometers across ocean expanses thousands of kilometers wide. The mechanisms of this mental mapping system are not fully understood by modern neuroscience, but they're clearly present and functional. The maps are encoded somehow in the bird's brain, maintained through genetic inheritance, and activated during migration. The evolution of migration also involved evolutionary changes to body structure that are visible in comparisons between migratory and non-migratory species. Migratory birds typically have longer, more pointed wings than non-migratory birds. These wing shapes are optimized for sustained flight over long distances. The wing loading, the ratio of body weight to wing area, is optimized for efficient cruising flight rather than maneuverability. Non-migratory birds tend to have shorter, more rounded wings, optimized for maneuverability in forest environments where tight turning and obstacle avoidance are important. The difference in wing shape is visible even in related species, where one species migrates and a close relative doesn't. Look at two thrush species, one migratory and one non-migratory, and the wing differences are immediately apparent. The migratory species has longer, more pointed wings. It looks built for distance. Migratory birds also evolved more efficient cardiovascular systems. The hearts of migratory birds are slightly larger and more muscular than non-migratory birds. The size difference might be 10 to 20%. But that difference scales with the bird's size. For a small songbird, that extra heart muscle is significant. The muscles of migratory birds show higher densities of mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles that power cellular metabolism. These little structures mitochondria, are where ATP is produced from fuel molecules. More mitochondria means more capacity to extract energy from fuel. More mitochondria means more efficient muscles. These physiological differences are fixed during development. A young migratory bird develops these characteristics naturally through genetic programming. A young non-migratory bird doesn't develop them. The differences are instinctive, genetic, encoded in the developmental program that builds the bird's body. The evolution of metabolic flexibility was crucial for long-distance migration and represents one of the most sophisticated adaptations of migratory birds. Migratory birds can shift their metabolism rapidly between different modes and different fuel sources. They can switch from normal feeding and activity to intensive hyperphagia mode, where feeding becomes the bird's entire focus. They can lower resting metabolic rate in preparation for migration, reducing the energy cost of existence so more food becomes fat storage. They can shift their fuel strategy from mixed protein and fat metabolism when conditions are optimal to nearly pure fat metabolism when flying. These metabolic shifts appear to be triggered by hormonal changes, driven by photoperiod changes. The genes that regulate these hormonal and metabolic shifts evolved specifically in migratory lineages. They're not present in non-migratory bird lineages. Non-migratory birds lack these capabilities entirely. Their metabolisms don't shift. They don't have the genetic programming for intensive fat storage or for the flexibility to switch fuel sources. Migration is not simply a behavioral choice that any bird can learn by observation. It's not a skill that can be taught. It's a suite of physiological, anatomical, and neurological adaptations that take millions of years of evolution to accumulate. It requires changes to the heart, to the muscles, to the metabolic systems, to the brain, to the hormonal systems. It requires genetic changes across multiple body systems. You can't create a migratory bird from a non-migratory bird through training or instruction. The differences are built into the genome. The timing of migration is controlled by a complex interplay of genetic programming and environmental cues that work together to synchronize the bird's behavior with environmental conditions. The primary environmental cue is photoperiod, the length of daylight. The photoperiod changes predictably throughout the year. In northern latitudes, in autumn, days grow progressively shorter. The nights grow longer. The proportion of the day that is darkness increases. As days grow shorter in autumn, many species recognize, at some level that's not conscious, that winter is approaching. The shortening day length triggers a cascade of hormonal changes in the bird's brain and body. The pituitary gland increases production of thyroid hormone. The thyroid gland responds by releasing thyroid hormone into the bloodstream. Thyroid hormone circulates through the body and increases metabolic rate. It stimulates appetite centers in the bird's brain. The bird becomes hungrier. It begins to feed more intensively. The bird enters hyperphagia, that state of frenzied feeding where food acquisition becomes the bird's primary activity. Every moment is spent finding and consuming food. The hunger is real. The drive to eat is intense. As days grow longer in spring, many species recognize that breeding season is approaching. Daylight hours increase. The proportion of the day that is light increases. These changes are predictable and consistent. The lengthening day length triggers a different cascade of hormonal changes. Reproductive organs begin to grow and develop. Hormones associated with breeding and territoriality are released. Migratory drive decreases. The bird's behavior shifts from migration-focused to breeding-focused. The bird prepares for breeding instead of migration. It begins to sing. It establishes territories. It seeks mates. These photoperiod responses are instinctive and genetic. Birds don't learn to respond to day length through experience. They don't understand the concept that longer days mean spring is coming. They're born with an internal clock that responds to changes in day length automatically. The mechanism appears to involve light-sensitive proteins in the eyes and the brain. Blue light exposure affects these proteins. The proteins transmit information to the brain about day length. The brain interprets this information and triggers the appropriate hormonal cascade. This mechanism is so fundamental that it appears across essentially all migratory bird species, and variations of it appear even in non-migratory birds. But photoperiod is not the only cue affecting migration timing. Temperature also plays a role. A sudden cold spell can trigger migration in species that are on the edge of readiness. A bird that has been preparing for migration for weeks, that is already accumulating fat, that is already sensing the approach of winter through photoperiod signals, might be triggered to actually depart by a sudden drop in temperature. The cold spell confirms what the photoperiod has been suggesting. It is actually getting cold. Winter is actually approaching. Time to leave. Availability of food influences the timing as well. If food suddenly becomes scarce, migration might be triggered, even if photoperiod suggests the bird should wait. A bird feeds on insects. Insects depend on warm temperatures. A sudden early cold spell kills insects. Food disappears. The bird can't wait for the calendar to say it's time to migrate. The bird has to leave now or starve. These multiple cues work together to fine-tune the timing of migration. The bird monitors all of them simultaneously. It monitors photoperiod. It monitors temperature. It monitors food availability. It monitors its own body condition and fat reserves. It monitors all these signals and then makes decisions about when to depart. The internal program provides a framework, but flexibility is built into the system. A bird that was rigidly locked to a single photoperiod would fail under variable conditions. If weather changed, if food availability shifted, if environmental conditions altered in unexpected ways, a rigid system would cause the bird to migrate at the wrong time and die. So birds evolved to be responsive, to monitor multiple cues, and to adjust timing within windows determined by genetic programming. The result is a system that's incredibly sophisticated and adaptive. Young birds on their first migration follow largely genetic programs. They inherit a basic knowledge of where to go, what direction to fly, roughly when to travel. They don't have experience to draw on. They don't know which route is safest or most efficient. They don't know where the best stopovers are located, but they go anyway, driven by genetic programming that compels them forward. They reach their destination sometimes by accident, sometimes by luck, but often successfully because the genetic programming is actually quite good. But as birds age and experience multiple migrations, they refine these skills through learning and experience. They learn specific stopover sites that are reliable and that have good food. They learn which winds are most favorable. They learn to read weather patterns and time their departures accordingly. They learn optimal timing based on conditions. Older birds are often more successful at migration than younger birds because they have accumulated experience. They know the routes. They know the risks. Older birds have lower mortality rates during migration. But young birds can still complete their first migration successfully because the genetic programming is so complete and so sophisticated. The bird doesn't need a parent to teach it. The bird doesn't need instruction from experienced birds. The bird's brain is already equipped with most of what it needs to know. The genetic programming has accumulated over millions of years of evolution. It contains the knowledge of thousands of generations of successful migrants. The young bird is born with this knowledge encoded in its brain. But genetic programming, no matter how sophisticated, cannot protect birds from problems that evolution did not prepare them for. The systems are elegant, refined, tested across millions of years. Evolution gave migratory birds everything they needed to survive in the world that existed when those adaptations were accumulating. And yet they're breaking down now, not because the birds are failing, but because the world they're flying through is changing faster than genetics can adapt. A genetic system that took millions of years to accumulate cannot be rewritten in decades. The bird's ability to navigate by stars and magnetic fields is useless if the stopover site where the bird expects to land has been converted to a port facility. The bird's capacity to store fat and fly non-stop for 11 days is meaningless if there's no food available at either end of the journey. The fundamental challenge facing migratory birds is not navigation or endurance or the physical capacity for flight. All of that is solved. The challenge is habitat. The places where birds need to stop, rest, feed, and refuel are disappearing. For millions of migrating birds, the journey cannot be completed without stopovers. A songbird cannot fly across the Sahara Desert without stopping at an oasis. A shorebird cannot cross the Pacific without reaching an island to rest. A warbler cannot make the transatlantic crossing without finding wetland habitat where insects are available in sufficient quantities. These stopovers are not luxuries, they are survival necessities. The bird's energy budget depends on them absolutely. Fail to find a stopover site, and the bird will run out of fuel mid-route. The bird will fall into the ocean or collapse mid-flight. It will die. For thousands of years, these stopover sites were relatively stable. The oases in North Africa were there when the warblers arrived. The wetlands of the Mediterranean basin held insects. The mudflats of the Yellow Sea provided abundance of invertebrates. The estuaries of the Americas remained shallow, rich feeding grounds. Birds had evolved their migration routes to reach these sites at exactly the right time, when food would be available, when the habitat would support intensive feeding. The system was calibrated across millennia. Birds arrived when they needed to arrive. Food was waiting. They fed, refueled, and continued. This worked. It worked for thousands of years because the habitats remained relatively constant. But that stability is gone now. The stopovers are disappearing. In some cases, they're being destroyed directly. Wetlands are drained for agriculture. Coastal mudflats are converted to ports or industrial areas. Estuaries are dammed. In other cases, stopovers are being degraded through pollution. Agricultural runoff creates dead zones where invertebrates cannot survive. Industrial pollution poisons water and sediments. Pesticides kill insects, leaving the habitat looking perfect but containing no food. The birds arrive, find no insects, cannot feed, and must continue without adequate fuel reserves. They fly into the next leg of migration weakened, exhausted, depleted. Many don't make it. The East Asian Australasian flyway is perhaps the most devastated example of stopover habitat loss. This flyway stretches from Arctic Russia down through China, Southeast Asia, and Australia. It supports over 50 million waterbirds, including species found nowhere else on Earth. One critical stopover site is the Yellow Sea, a shallow tidal zone between China and Korea where invertebrates flourish and birds can feed intensively. The mudflats of the Yellow Sea have been critical to migration success for thousands of years. The timing is precise. Birds arrive during specific weeks when food availability peaks. They feed for 2 to 3 weeks, rebuilding fat reserves, then continue southward. The system worked because the habitat was stable. Since the 1950s, over 65% of the Yellow Sea's tidal flats have been destroyed. 65%. Gone. Converted to port facilities, industrial areas, aquaculture ponds, land reclamation projects. The remaining habitat is fragmented, degraded, insufficient. Birds that historically found abundant food now find sparse invertebrate populations. The birds cannot feed adequately in the time available. They continue southward with insufficient reserves. Mortality during the southern crossing increased noticeably after the habitat destruction began. Studies tracking bird populations through this flyway show survival rates have declined. Fewer birds reach breeding grounds. Fewer birds make it to wintering areas. Some species are now threatened with extinction, not because they cannot fly, but because they cannot find food along the way. The spoon-billed sandpiper is an example of a species pushed toward extinction by yellow sea habitat loss. This tiny shorebird, weighing perhaps 50 grams, is one of the rarest birds on Earth. Only a few hundred remain in the entire world. The species is so rare that every individual matters. Each bird that dies during migration is a significant percentage loss for the entire species. The species depends almost entirely on the yellow sea stopovers during migration. With 65% of that habitat destroyed, the birds cannot feed adequately. The invertebrate populations that sustained populations for thousands of years are gone. The birds try to feed in the remaining mudflats, but there simply isn't enough food. Populations have collapsed. The breeding population that successfully reaches Arctic breeding grounds each year has shrunk from thousands to a few hundred. The species is functionally endangered, not because of direct hunting or predation, not because the birds are weak or incapable, but because the places it needs to survive no longer exist. The spoon-billed sandpiper might go extinct within the next few decades unless habitat is restored or alternative stopovers become available. Across other flyways, the pattern is similar. The Americas flyways, supporting species like the red knot, depend on wetland habitats that are being destroyed. The Delaware Bay stopover, where red knots feed on horseshoe crab eggs, is threatened by development and changing crab populations. The Gulf Coast wetlands, critical for trans-Gulf crossing birds, are degraded by oil drilling, coastal development, and pollution. The Mediterranean coastlines, important for trans-Saharan migrants, are developed for tourism and agriculture. Each region tells the same story. Habitat loss, degradation, fragmentation, the stopovers shrinking, disappearing, becoming insufficient. But habitat destruction is only one piece of the problem. Climate change is now rewriting the rules that birds have followed for millions of years. The system that birds evolved to navigate, the synchronization between breeding seasons and food availability, the precise timing of migration and arrival, all of it was based on climate patterns that have been relatively stable for thousands of years. Birds evolved to arrive at breeding grounds when food availability peaks, when insects emerge, when plants produce seeds and berries, when nesting conditions are optimal. The timing is incredibly precise because the margin for error is small. Arrive too early and the food isn't ready. The birds starve. Arrive too late and the breeding season is compressed. Chicks don't have enough time to grow before fall migration begins. For millions of years, these events were synchronized. Day length increased in spring at the same time temperatures rose and food became available. Birds responded to changing day length and departed breeding grounds, arriving at distant wintering grounds at exactly the moment when food availability peaked there as well. The whole system was one integrated machine, driven by seasonal cycles that were reliable and predictable. But climate change is desynchronizing this system. Rising temperatures mean that food availability is changing. Spring is arriving earlier in some regions and later in others. The emergence of insects is shifting. The timing of plant growth is becoming unpredictable. Photoperiod, the day length that birds use to time migration, is not changing. The Earth's tilt and rotation are not different, but the relationship between photoperiod and actual food availability is breaking down. A bird might arrive at a breeding ground, having responded to the traditional photoperiod cues, only to find that insects have not yet emerged because temperatures are still low. Or the opposite, the bird might arrive to find insects have already peaked and are now declining. The food is not there when the bird expected it to be there. This phenological mismatch is creating serious problems for populations. Studies tracking multiple species across years show that the degree of mismatch is increasing. In years with more mismatch, breeding success declines. Fewer chicks are raised, fewer birds reach fledging. In extreme cases, entire breeding seasons fail when food is unavailable during critical chick-rearing periods. The problem is particularly acute for trans-Saharan migrants. The Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Basin are becoming increasingly inhospitable due to climate change. Temperatures are rising, rainfall is becoming less predictable, wetlands are drying up. The few scattered oases that have served as critical stopovers for thousands of years are shrinking. The vegetation that provides insects and seeds is declining. Birds that evolved to stop at specific oases now find them degraded, less productive, sometimes completely dry. They cannot feed adequately. They press onward with insufficient reserves, gambling on finding the next stopover site before fuel runs out. Rising temperatures in Africa are changing precipitation patterns. Some regions are getting drier. Others are experiencing more extreme weather fluctuations. Wetlands that were reliable for centuries are drying up in drought years, then flooding in wet years. The birds cannot time their migrations to match this unpredictability. A bird that arrives at a stopover site during a drought year finds no water, no food. Mortality spikes during these years. Survival rates plummet. Some populations face catastrophic losses, with 50 to 70% mortality in bad years. The birds that survive are those that manage to find alternative routes, alternative stopovers, or that had sufficient fat reserves to skip a traditional stopover entirely. But not all birds have these options. Climate change is also affecting the seasonal ice dynamics of the Arctic itself, where many migratory birds breed. The Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth. The sea ice that once remained stable throughout the breeding season is now melting earlier. Open water appears earlier in spring, then freezes later in autumn. The timing of ice breakup is changing, affecting the availability of food for breeding birds. A bird that evolved to breed at a certain latitude will find that the seasonal calendar has shifted. The ice breaks up 2 weeks earlier than historical norms. The bird has inherited the instinct to migrate north and breed at a certain time. It arrives at its breeding grounds to find conditions different from what it expects. Some ice-dependent species find their food, these sources becoming unavailable during critical breeding periods. Seals and other ice-associated animals that birds depend on for food are being affected by the loss of ice. The ability to raise chicks depends on food availability, and that availability is being disrupted by changing ice dynamics. Other species are being affected by changes in ocean productivity. Upwelling patterns that bring nutrient-rich water to the surface are shifting due to changing current patterns and wind regimes. Fish populations are responding to changing temperatures. Seabirds that depend on these fish populations find food availability unpredictable. The stable ocean food webs that they evolved to exploit are becoming chaotic and unstable. The phenological mismatch between bird arrival and peak food availability is projected to worsen significantly over the coming decades. Climate models suggest that temperate regions will experience even greater shifts in the timing of spring events. If current trends continue, the mismatch will increase in most regions. Birds will arrive to find food peaks occurring earlier than expected. Or They'll arrive too late and miss the peak entirely. The bird's internal clocks are unlikely to evolve rapidly enough to keep pace with these changes. Evolution works on timescales of many generations. The climate is changing on timescales of years to decades. The birds simply cannot adapt genetically fast enough. Some populations may show behavioral flexibility, adjusting departure dates by a few days or weeks based on cues other than photoperiod. But the margin for adjustment is small. A bird cannot change its arrival timing by months without running into other problems, like competing with birds that arrived earlier for limited food. Beyond habitat loss and climate mismatches, migratory birds face immediate threats from human infrastructure. Wind turbines, power lines, buildings, and light pollution kill hundreds of millions of birds annually. Collisions with human-made structures represent one of the largest human-caused sources of bird mortality. For some migratory species, collision deaths exceed natural mortality. The birds are killed not by predators or disease, but by flying into objects in the darkness or during poor visibility conditions. A migrating bird navigating at night using stars and magnetic fields might collide with a tall building, a communications tower, or a wind turbine because the structure obscures the stars or blocks the magnetic field cues. The bird's navigation system becomes confused. It strikes the structure. It falls to the ground, dead. In North America, particularly during spring and fall migration, millions of birds collide with buildings in cities. The birds are migrating at night when conditions are good for navigation, but the buildings are lit by lights designed for human activities, not bird migration. The lights disorient the birds. The birds become trapped in zones of light and shadow, confused about which way is up or which direction to fly. They circle, exhausting themselves, then collide with glass, metal, or concrete. Entire flocks can be wiped out by a single building if conditions are right. Some cities are now turning off lights during migration seasons to reduce deaths, but most cities have not implemented these measures. Wind turbines are a newer problem, having appeared on the landscape only in the last few decades, but they're increasing in number as renewable energy production expands. Large wind farms contain hundreds or thousands of turbines, each with rotating blades that can strike a bird traveling at migration altitude. A large raptor or seabird hit by a turbine blade might be killed instantly. Some populations of golden eagles and other raptors have seen significant increases in collision mortality near wind farms. For some species, the impact is serious enough to threaten population viability. The problem is particularly acute in areas where wind farms are positioned along major migration routes. A bird flying through a narrow mountain pass might find the passage filled with turbines. Avoiding them requires detecting them at distance and altering flight path, both of which consume extra energy during an already exhausting migration. Power lines kill many migrating birds. Unlike wind turbines, which kill relatively few birds but are very visible, power lines kill large numbers of birds that don't see the lines in dim light. A bird flying at night or during poor visibility might collide with a power line and be electrocuted, or simply struck and killed by the impact. The bird is traveling at considerable speed, perhaps 50 or 60 kilometers per hour. It strikes a thin line it never saw coming. The collision is fatal. Large species like swans and cranes are particularly vulnerable because their large wings and slow maneuverability make them less able to avoid obstacles. They need distance to change direction. A power line gives them no distance and no warning. In some regions, hundreds of thousands of large waterfowl are killed annually by power line collisions. These are not estimates or projections. They're documented through dead birds found beneath lines, through surveys of migration corridors, through direct observation of collisions. The infrastructure that supplies human electricity is, in effect, a lethal hazard for birds simply trying to migrate. Most power lines were installed without any consideration for birds. They're positioned where human electrical needs dictate, not where bird migration routes are. Light pollution compounds these problems. Artificial lights at night disorient migrating birds. The birds are attracted to lights, become trapped in areas of light and darkness, exhaust themselves, and either collide with structures or simply fall exhausted to the ground. During nights when weather is poor and migrants are flying low, disorientated by thick cloud cover and unable to navigate effectively, artificial lights become particularly deadly. Birds that would normally fly at altitude during clear nights are forced lower by cloud cover, where artificial lights are more visible and more disorienting. The combination of poor weather and extensive artificial lighting creates a trap. Large numbers of birds can die during single nights when conditions align unfavorably. The scale of these collision deaths is staggering. Estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of birds are killed annually in the United States alone by collisions with buildings, power lines, and other human infrastructure. These are not hypothetical numbers. They're documented through surveys of dead birds found beneath tall structures. The actual number is probably higher because many birds fall in remote areas where they're never found. When a bird collides with a power line in a forest at night, no one sees it. The carcass decomposes. The death is never recorded, but the bird is still dead. For some species, particularly migrants that concentrate along narrow corridors during spring and fall migration, the collision toll is severe enough to affect population sizes directly. But perhaps the most insidious threat to migratory birds is habitat loss during the non-breeding season. A bird might survive the migration, successfully breed, raise chicks, and then attempt to return to winter habitat only to find that wintering grounds have been destroyed. Many migratory birds overwinter in tropical regions, where wintering habitat is often on small islands, coastal mangroves, or other specialized habitats. These habitats are being destroyed for development, tourism, agriculture, and aquaculture. A warbler that breeds in temperate North America might depend on specific mangrove habitat in the Caribbean or Central America for overwinter survival. If that habitat is cleared for resort development or for shrimp farms, the bird has nowhere to go. It can survive the migration north to breeding grounds. It can breed successfully, but then it must find somewhere to survive winter, and its traditional habitat is gone. The bird starves or is forced into marginal habitat where survival odds are low. Species with high site fidelity, where individual birds return to the same wintering site every year, are particularly vulnerable. If a bird has specialized on a particular mangrove forest or coastal lagoon as its winter home, and that habitat is destroyed, the bird must either adapt to new habitat or die. Most cannot adapt. They search for their familiar habitat, find it gone, and perish. Even species that can theoretically use alternative wintering habitat face challenges. The availability of good wintering habitat is limited. If traditional wintering areas are lost, competing for remaining habitat becomes intense. Birds that would normally have had sufficient food and shelter now must share with displaced populations from destroyed habitats. Competition increases. Food availability per bird declines. Survival rates drop. These losses compound across populations, affecting the number of birds that successfully return to breeding grounds the following year, which affects breeding success, which affects the number of birds attempting to migrate the following year. Conservation efforts addressing these threats must operate on multiple fronts simultaneously because the problems are interconnected. You cannot protect a migratory bird species by protecting only breeding habitat or only wintering habitat. You must protect both. You must also protect migration corridors, protect stopovers, manage climate change, reduce collision mortality, and restore degraded habitats. The distances involved in migration mean that birds cross political boundaries regularly. A red knot that breeds in Canadian Arctic also migrates through US states, Mexico, and South America. It winters in Argentina. Conservation of this species requires cooperation between nations. Laws must align. Habitat protection must be coordinated across borders. This is extraordinarily difficult because countries have different priorities, different economic interests, different political systems. International agreements have been established to address these challenges. The Ramsar Convention protects wetland habitats critical for migratory birds. The Bonn Convention addresses the conservation of migratory species. Bilateral agreements between countries coordinate protection of specific birds and habitats. These agreements represent real commitments to protect migratory birds and their habitats. But implementation is uneven. Some countries have strong enforcement. Others lack the resources or political will to enforce protections. Wetlands designated as protected under Ramsar agreements are sometimes still destroyed because enforcement is weak or political pressure overrides conservation concerns. The frameworks exist, the commitment is stated, but the reality of conservation is often frustratingly slow and incomplete. Habitat restoration projects are underway in many regions. Wetlands that have been drained are being re-flooded. Mangrove forests that were cleared are being replanted. Salt marshes are being restored. These projects are often successful at restoring ecosystem function, creating habitat that supports birds and other wildlife. Some restored wetlands have become productive stopover sites within a few years of restoration. But restoration takes time, much longer than we might hope. A wetland that was drained decades ago might take years or even decades to become fully productive again. The soil chemistry must shift. Plants must establish and spread. Invertebrate communities must recover from the absence of water and the degradation that occurred during the drained period. Microbial communities must re-establish. The food web must reassemble, predator and prey, in the right proportions. The birds cannot wait for habitat to be restored. They arrive to find existing habitat, which may be severely degraded or insufficient. They arrive this year, next year, the year after. They need food now, not in 5 or 10 years. Restoration projects help for the future, but they don't immediately solve the problems facing birds today. There's a temporal mismatch between the pace of habitat restoration and the urgency of bird migration. The birds operate on an annual cycle. They arrive and need food immediately. Habitat restoration operates on timescales of years to decades. Some conservation efforts focus on creating protected corridors for migration. These corridors link breeding habitat, stopover sites, and wintering habitat, creating continuous protected pathways for birds to follow. But creating corridors is difficult in a world where land is intensively used for human purposes. A corridor might need to pass through agricultural land, urban areas, industrial zones. Getting agreement to protect these areas for bird migration when economic pressure exists to develop them is challenging. Some countries have successfully established protected migration corridors, but in many regions, corridors are fragmented or inadequately protected. Direct protection of birds through law enforcement against hunting is important in regions where migratory birds face hunting pressure. Many migratory birds are hunted legally or illegally along migration routes. Hunting pressure can be substantial, particularly on waterfowl and shorebirds where traditional hunting practices continue. In some regions, unregulated hunting has decimated populations. Enforcing hunting regulations, particularly along migration routes that cross multiple countries, is difficult, Birds harvested in one country might have been produced in another country's breeding areas. The loss affects both countries. Coordination of hunting regulations across countries is necessary to prevent overharvesting, but achieving agreement is politically complex. Some conservation programs focus on specific species or populations that are particularly endangered. Breeding programs have been established for species so rare that only a few hundred individuals remain. The goal is to raise chicks in captivity, then release them to the wild to bolster wild populations. For some species, this has worked. Populations have been recovered from the brink of extinction. But for migratory species, the challenges are greater. You cannot simply breed birds in captivity and release them. They have no parental guidance. They must somehow navigate routes they've never flown. They must find stopovers they've never encountered. Some captive-bred birds are tracked by researchers to learn how they perform in the wild. Survival rates vary, some thrive. Others perish because they lack the experience or knowledge to navigate successfully. Wind farm development is increasingly being managed to reduce bird mortality. New wind farms are being sited in locations less critical for migration. Existing farms are implementing measures to reduce collisions, including radar systems that can detect birds and shut down turbines when birds approach. These technological solutions are still being refined and they're expensive. But they demonstrate that collision mortality can be reduced through careful management. Other infrastructure development is being evaluated for bird compatibility. Buildings are being designed with bird strike reduction in mind, using colours and materials that are more visible to birds, or positioning windows and glass in ways that reduce strikes. Power lines in critical bird areas are being buried underground to reduce collision risks. Light pollution is being addressed in some cities by turning off lights during migration seasons or using lights that are less disorienting to birds. Pesticide use is being reduced in some regions to protect insects, which are the primary food source for many migratory birds. The widespread use of neonicotinoid pesticides has been linked to dramatic declines in insect populations in agricultural areas. Without insects, birds cannot feed adequately. By reducing pesticide use, particularly during migration seasons, insect populations can recover, providing more abundant food for birds. Some countries have banned neonicotinoids. Others are implementing restrictions. But in many agricultural regions, pesticide use continues largely unchecked. The birds arrive at stopover sites to find insufficient food because insect populations have been decimated by pesticides. They cannot feed adequately and must continue migration in weakened condition. Climate change mitigation is the ultimate solution to phenological mismatch and climate-driven habitat degradation, but it operates on a much longer timescale than other conservation efforts. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions requires global cooperation and fundamental changes to energy systems. These changes are happening, but slowly. Renewable energy deployment is accelerating. Carbon pricing mechanisms are being established. But global emissions continue to rise. Even if emissions peak and decline in the next few years, climate change will continue for decades due to the warming already built into the system. The birds will face continued disruption of their breeding and wintering ecosystems regardless of what we do now. The momentum of climate change cannot be stopped immediately. The best we can do is limit the magnitude of future change. But that requires urgent action on emissions reduction, which is a political problem, not a biological one. The future of bird migration is uncertain. Some species will likely persist and may even thrive if they can adapt to changing conditions or find alternative habitats and migration routes. The generalist species, the ones that can eat many kinds of food, and use many kinds of habitat, probably have reasonable chances of persisting. Other species, particularly those with specialized habitat requirements or narrow migration corridors, face serious risk of extinction. The specialists, the birds that evolved to depend on specific food sources at specific locations at specific times, are the ones facing the greatest risk. The Arctic tern, with its flexibility and its vast oceanic migration route, might persist despite climate change and habitat degradation. The bird is not specialized on any single stopover site. It can feed on many kinds of fish. It can breed in many locations across the Arctic. This flexibility gives it resilience. But species like the spoon-billed sandpiper, already reduced to fewer than 1,000 individuals and dependent on specific stopovers that are being destroyed, face uncertain futures. The bar-tailed godwit, dependent on specific stopovers in the Yellow Sea that have been largely destroyed, shows declining populations despite the species' remarkable physiological capacities. The remarkable ability to fly 11,000 kilometers non-stop means nothing if the landing sites at either end have disappeared. All the genetic programming, all the navigational sophistication, all the metabolic flexibility becomes irrelevant when the physical landscape has changed beyond recognition. In the best-case scenario, conservation efforts accelerate, protected habitat networks are expanded, stopovers are restored, collision mortality is reduced, climate change is mitigated aggressively. Under these conditions, many bird populations could stabilize or recover. The International Union for Conservation of Nature has identified specific conservation actions that, if implemented, could prevent extinction of many threatened migratory species. These actions are not impossibly expensive or technically infeasible. They're challenging, but they're doable. The barrier is not biological or technological. It's political and economic. We lack the collective will to prioritize bird conservation over immediate economic interests. In the worst-case scenario, habitat loss accelerates. Coastal wetlands are developed further. Agricultural intensification increases pesticide use. Climate change intensifies at even faster rates than currently projected. Collision mortality remains high as infrastructure proliferation continues. Under these conditions, populations of migratory birds would decline precipitously. Species once numbering in the millions would dwindle to thousands or disappear entirely. Some would go extinct entirely. The loss would be permanent and irreversible. The migratory routes that have been followed for millions of years would become silent. The birds that once moved between continents would simply cease to exist. You would never see the Arctic tern passing overhead during spring migration. You would never witness the bar-tailed godwit's impossible Pacific crossing. The loss would also represent a loss of ecological function. Migratory birds play crucial roles in ecosystems throughout their ranges. They pollinate flowers in their breeding grounds. They disperse seeds across continents. They control insect populations, both through direct predation and through the ecological effects of their presence. They are prey for other animals, feeding raptors, mammals, and larger birds. Remove them, and entire ecosystems change in ways that cascade through ecological networks. Predators lose food, plants lose pollinators, seed dispersal patterns shift, ecological networks unravel, and the consequences ripple outward in unpredictable ways. The path forward will likely fall somewhere between these extremes. Some conservation successes will occur, some species will persist or recover, others will be lost. The overall trajectory will depend on decisions made in the next decade. The choices we make now about habitat protection, climate action, and infrastructure development will shape the future of bird migration more than anything else. The birds themselves have done everything they can. They've evolved extraordinary physiological capacities. They've developed sophisticated navigation systems. They've adapted their behaviors across millions of years. They're still doing it now, adapting to changes, seeking alternative routes, finding ways to persist in a changing world. The limits to their adaptation are being reached, not because they're weak or incapable, but because the changes are happening too fast and too broadly for evolutionary adaptation to keep pace. The birds have given us everything they have. What we do with their gift of migration, whether we protect it or allow it to fade, is now entirely up to us.